Oh, hello. Isn't this a surprise? I didn't think I'd be going back to God of War until I was ready to take on the Norse duology, but not only might that be sooner than expected because of the recent State of Play announcements, but there's also a new game out now that's a prequel set when Kratos and Deimos were kids, well before the events of Ghost of Sparta, at least the flashbacks anyway.
Both of these announcements have been rumored for the last year or so, remakes of the original trilogy and a side-scrolling Metroidvania. And for each State of Play or Jeff Keighley showcase, people would get their hopes up for nothing because it was never revealed until just recently.
I figured that because I've looked at every other Greek God of War game, I'd make a video talking about the remake announcements and then also just reviewing this brand new game because, like I said, I've looked at every other Greek God of War game, save for the Java phone game, God of War Betrayal. I don't know if that's ever something I'll be able to actually play for myself. And I went back and rewatched those old reviews on the God of War games, and man, are those aged really poorly. I was not that good at making videos yet.
I'll get my thoughts on the remake announcement out of the way now. I think it's going to be interesting. The originals hold up amazingly in my opinion, and I would have been satisfied with just a native port of all the games that didn't get remastered like God of War 3 did. But full-blown remakes could do a lot to enhance some parts that didn't age well. Mainly some of the platforming segments, maybe the pacing in God of War 1, making all the weapons usable without needing to pause in God of War 2, things like that. Or even just to touch up the story. I've said before that the classic games do have an interesting story and development for Kratos, but not only do you have to look for it, but there are some parts that could do with some tweaking, like Ares admitting to tricking Kratos, or explaining the time travel stuff to not involve a paradox, while also putting more emphasis on the character moments that are overshadowed by the intensity of the games that they're in. Though doing that without the prequel trilogy might be kind of hard. I would definitely prefer them to stay mostly the same because what I like about the classic games is different from what I like about the modern games. I don't want RPG mechanics, shops, stats outside of maybe an indicator as to which weapon does more base damage. I know some people think that fixed cameras are outdated, and I get that for like early Resident Evil or DMC1. I don't think those games use the camera angle as effectively as they could, and at times it gets in the way, but I've never had that problem with God of War, and I think the camera angle does a lot for the combat and the scale of anything. Atlas and Chronos wouldn't work in the Norse games, it wouldn't be nearly as effective, and I think these aspects are more integral to the identity of these games than they were for Resident Evil because they are used more effectively.
That being said, as long as they port the original God of War 1 and 2 to modern consoles, then they can go nuts for all I care. Sort of like Resident Evil 4, how that game's on every system, so when they remade it, they kind of had to change things to warrant remaking it in the first place. Because, you know, as long as the original games are preserved, then I don't think a remake taking liberties and trying something experimental or new would be as big a missed opportunity because the originals are always going to be there, and as long as they are readily available, then there's no reason for me to be super upset if the remakes drop the ball in some place or are too similar to the current games, which I don't like as much. I do prefer the more kinetic and lightweight feel of the combat from the original games, as I think that it creates a good contrast with the Norse games, making them feel completely different, and I think that is to its benefit, and making them all play the same would be to its detriment. And that original combat style, and even just some of the artistic choices that they make with the camera angles, are required for the combat and just the identity of those games. Either way, especially after Ragnarok Valhalla, I know that they're going to be fun games, I know that they're going to do the originals justice, but I'd be lying if I said I wouldn't be a little disappointed if they played too similarly to the modern games.
But there's no point in speculating on games that won't be shown until, I give it 2 years at most. I know they said it would be a while, but if they were slated for something like 2030, then I think it would make more sense for the studio to announce it as a 25th anniversary game rather than tack it on to the end of the 20th. But what we have right now that we can actually play and sink our teeth into is God of War Sons of Sparta, developed as a passion project with help from Megacat Studios, the team behind Into the Pit from a couple years back. I remember really liking the style of that game for the most part. I think Spring Bonnie could look a little off at times and not in the creepy way that they intended. The only real similarity between these games is the art style and the animation, which is just a treat to look at, especially the backgrounds. There are so many stunning locations and enemies, some that are cool to see in a new art style, and some that suck shit in the original games, like these guys who I lovingly refer to as these fuckers in my first God of War video.
Also, this is a brand new game, so I'm going to put a spoiler warning here. I'm not going to talk about what happens at the end of the story or some of the twists or reveals that they have, but you might see some gameplay things from late game that you might want to go in blind for. That's entirely up to you. Like I said, I'm not going to say anything that happens in the story, but there will be things alluded to, and if you want to experience the game fully blind, then I don't recommend watching this video. But if you just want to know if the game is good, I'll say that it is definitely a lot of fun. But then it just kind of keeps on going, and the progression gets a little questionable at times while still being enjoyable, but you definitely start to feel its length towards the end.
This game exists as a story from Kratos' childhood that he's telling to his daughter Calliope. T.C. Carson reprises his role as adult Kratos, and man, is his calmer voice when talking to his daughter such a departure from what I'm used to. He had his calm moments in the older games, but even with those, his voice had a razor-sharp edge to it.
Duty. Do you know the meaning of the word, Calliope?
Grave? In the middle of a battle? Who will occupy it, old man?
But here, there were times that I forgot that not that long after this game, he would kill her with his own hands. And the game is aware of that too, because there are a few times Kratos talks about her growing up and how she has a lot of time to decide who she would become, and all I could think about is she doesn't have that much time left. Same goes for his brother Deimos. The bulk of the game is Kratos and Deimos searching for Vasilis, another Spartan around their age who has gone missing. They're given these buff-like Kurgans to help guide them, and it has magic abilities, and in terms of story, not a whole lot happens until the end. Sort of like the older games now that I think about it. The main draw of the story to me is getting to see what Kratos' life was like as a child, because despite being raised as a disciplined Spartan, he was still a kid. The conversations with Deimos do wonders to make Ghost of Sparta all the more tragic. It was sad before, as someone who loves my brother, I don't need much to believe that this was crushing for Kratos. But in this game, you really see how close they were. They were really good friends, they joke with each other, and the logs even say that Deimos rivals Kratos in raw talent, Kratos just being much more disciplined and dedicated to Sparta than Deimos is, whose view on his duty as a Spartan often contrasts with Kratos, who's very no-nonsense about it. Throughout their search for Vasilis, Kratos doesn't hide his disdain for him, thinking he's not cut out to be a Spartan, while Deimos wants to find him anyway because he thinks it's the right thing to do. He knows his family mourns for him, and even if they just find a body, he wants to give them closure, even at the risk of his own reputation and duties to Sparta. Kratos, even at this young age, is established to have a high level of respect because of his dedication. He even has friends, people he respects. He and Deimos talk about girls, they vent to each other. And this game shows Deimos as a very competent fighter, which goes to sort of explain how he was as helpful as he was to Kratos at the end of Ghost of Sparta, especially considering that the flashbacks in that game depict Deimos as much weaker. But as much as I like these moments, that's all that they are in the grand scheme of the story, which in my opinion drags on like a bitch. You spend so long looking for Vasilis with no progress whatsoever. Most leads are all dead ends and you could shuffle them up and put them in a different order with next to no alterations. There was a time around 8 hours in where the only indication that I was nearing the end was the fact that I was 8 hours in. A lot of the cutscenes exist solely to shine light on the characters and their relationships, and I do like those scenes, but then there are times where it's established that in order to partake in the search, Kratos and Deimos are getting others to do their chores. But then when they get back, they get shit for slacking on their chores anyway. But then that doesn't factor in because they make the same deal again to keep searching, with no pushback from Kratos, who's only really on this journey for Deimos' sake, at least at the start. And this is after a short spat they had where they were annoyed with each other. I figured that this would mean that they got closer to a middle point between them, where Deimos would take a step back to focus on his duty the way that Kratos would, and then something would come up that prompts Kratos to be the one to set them back on their quest. Which does happen just after they get reprimanded a second time, a little bit later after this initial scene. It just makes it feel almost out of place, like we're retreading the same idea only to do it right the second time. there's no consequence to the first time they get reprimanded. It just leads to another lead, one that should have been the first guess, if I'm being honest, because it's a training place that they know he was told would be a good place to train without eyes on him. Don't get me wrong, the story does get good towards the last couple hours or so. The whole ending segment is just beautiful. God damn, it hit me like a fucking truck. I won't spoil it, but those of you who know, damn. I wish that feeling was spread more throughout the game. This is the only part that feels like it pertains to the idea of what duty means, which is why Kratos is telling Calliope this story in the first place, in case I didn't mention that. I wish that this had gotten more focused throughout, but trust me that when I say that the ending is worth it.
The game itself at times feels conflicted at what it wants to be. Nothing that got in the way of it being fun for the most part, but there are mechanics and layers of stuff that feel kind of just tacked on and don't really add anything of value in my opinion.
When I say that the progression in this game is questionable, I don't mean for a Metroidvania. It has all the hallmarks. You see a thing that you can't get all over the map, then suddenly you have the means to get there, and traversal becomes easier as a whole, and at times they even help with combat. This game is more akin to Castlevania than Metroid, but I'm more familiar with Metroid, so that's my frame of reference for what a good Metroidvania is and how I'm mainly going to compare it, but I promise it still works either way. This game has the RPG and gear mechanics from the Norse God of War games, but it doesn't feel like you get things frequently enough to encourage experimentation. By the time I would get new spear parts, the ones I had would be upgraded quite a bit, and when that's the only gear you really get that increases your level, I don't want to try something else because it's by default a downgrade. I feel like the newer gear you should get should at least be comparable to the gear that you already have this deep into the game. But it's not, so it feels like I chose all my gear in the first few hours and didn't progress past it the whole game. In order to give new gear a fair shot, you would have to upgrade it to be comparable to your current stuff, and if you do that and then realize you don't like it, that's too bad because you've just now wasted all of those resources. And this also affects the secrets you can find. I found a lot of these puzzles to be satisfying and well designed, but that's all the reward really amounts to, because often the chest you get has a piece of gear you don't want, or supplies to upgrade gear that you don't use. Compare that to Metroid, where often the reward is immediate. You now have more ammo or health. The closest this game gets to that is through the olive trees and statues that give you offerings to give to the gods. One of which I had to look up because hearing them call her Nike was distracting and it felt like an ad, which I'm almost certain was the joke, but it caught me off guard every time. The issue with these is that you have to bring them back to that god's temple, meaning finding the closest temple and then using it to fast travel to the right temple. I can't stand, and I want you to hear this too, when you find an upgrade and then have to backtrack to actually gain its effects. It's so easy to forget that you got these, and it's a little tedious to go cash them in when you do remember. It should have been just one temple that accepts every offering, or better yet, immediate rewards. This is the only way to upgrade these abilities. You can't put red orbs into them like the old games to get new moves or more power. There is a skill tree full of upgrades that you do spend blood orbs on, but honestly almost none of them appeal to me. They either require you to use the spirit meter, which I know I won't think to do. I wouldn't think to press both bumpers for a more powerful parry. It reminds me of how they botched the parry in God of War Ascension, although you do have a regular parry in this game, thank God. But with how often I would already do moves that spend meter completely on accident, I don't want to add another input that might drain it more. I used special moves on accident so many times, and that would happen occasionally in the old games. I think everyone is guilty of accidentally spamming Cyclone of Chaos, but it got insane here. It felt like an accident almost every single time. The upgrades you get in this game don't feel like new moves that can change how I approach combat. Hell, at a certain point I was just avoiding enemies whenever I could get away with it, only really fighting the bosses, which I do think are a highlight of this game. Not that fighting normal enemies isn't fun, but they just take way too long to kill. They have the health of the enemies from the main games, which I don't think lends itself well to a Metroidvania like this. It's not snappy to fight them like in a Castlevania or Metroid game. It can get really tedious to just fight a regular enemy in this game. I don't want to make it seem like all these things make the game significantly worse or less fun, but rather they feel ultimately pointless, and if the game had taken a simpler approach to these things, like having the upgrades be like the classic games, then it wouldn't feel like there's the dead weight of mechanics that aren't necessary. It looks and feels important, so with how often I just don't have the stuff to upgrade, it feels like I'm doing something wrong. I know it would be handled better, but this definitely reaffirms that I don't want these systems in the remakes. I don't enjoy them as much as I do just a simple upgrade menu. The combat can definitely feel unfair at times, although I would find that a second or third attempt at most encounters, I'd be able to get a pretty good rhythm and go through without much issue, though I still have my problems with it. The main one is the lack of health that you get. You seldom see green orbs, and they barely do anything half the time. Even the spirit attacks, which are meant to farm stun and green orbs, don't really do much for giving you your health back. It feels like if you get hit, then that health is just gone for a while. While the sprites and animation are amazing, it's often hard to read attacks. There was a boss fight where Demos just turned off and stopped fighting with me, and there are too many types of attacks. Like, okay, unblockable is pretty standard for God of War games, especially now, but then there's ones that you can't block or dodge, some that you can't parry and can only block. Dodging while standing still and while moving are technically two different moves, and there are attacks that are immune to both of those separately from each other, and I don't even remember what purple attacks were. I had all of those problems through most of the game, only to find out that you actually can upgrade your health, magic, and spirit after you get all of the abilities in the skill tree. I was hoarding my orbs like an idiot because I didn't think it was necessary for me to get any of the abilities I didn't want, and missed out on the ability to make my life so much easier because they did a poor job explaining it to me, or maybe I missed it because, like I said, I am an idiot. The game can also be fairly buggy, nothing that really impacted gameplay aside from Demos shutting down, but sometimes dialogue wouldn't play immediately, or subtitles would be late or early, audio cues would play when you respawn, or sometimes this will happen on the map, or Kratos will do this. Also, some of the areas are just bland, like all the straightaways with nothing to do just for a side objective that adds to a checklist of things that you, I guess, were thinking about doing. And with the run button using spirit meter for some stupid reason, traversal can be so tedious. Damn you, Nike! Despite all my problems though, after a couple tries I would manage to get a good feel for the fights, and the feeling of getting through them was amazing. I wish all the combat felt like the boss fights, but regular enemies just don't die fast enough, or don't get stunned when the meter is full. This game won't scratch the God of War itch if you want something that plays like the mainline games, Norse or Greek. It's not that kind of game, which was the point, but it still lacks the flash and versatility of those games. Even the stun kills are pretty basic. And the music, while being really good, I definitely need to give it a re-listen to fully appreciate it. It doesn't have the vibe of the music from the other games at all, which is a shame because the music in any of the other God of War games is a league above any other game's music. But like I said, I still need to give it a re-listen because it would be unfair to judge it just because it's not what I'm familiar with, although the credits song was really jarring. If you like Metroidvanias or even just the world of God of War, the game is only $30, so do with that information what you will. And not only are replays what I think truly make or break a Metroidvania, but now that I'm not being an ignorant asshole and missing half the mechanics and upgrades, I would imagine that I'll have a much better time on revisits than I did this first time. And maybe some of my issues with the pacing came from this being a shadow drop that was way longer than I expected it to be. And like I said, it does pay off. The ending segments and conversations are amazing, but my main complaint with the plot still remains that things just happen that could have been in almost any order without needing a rewrite.
Anyway, back to regularly scheduled videos. I still owe you guys Hitman contracts, though I have a few other projects that I've, at least in my head, prioritized because I haven't really been in the mood to play Classic Hitman, and I don't want to force myself to play it and then end up hating the game. I think that'd be unfair. I have a little bit of integrity. But I hope that you all have a great day, a beautiful morning, an awesome night. If it is your birthday, then happy birthday. Take care.